Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast, brought to you by Libertas. This is Ernst Roots. Now, we have been overwhelmed with messages of support, with people signing up, with people asking how they can become more involved, and also with people sending us some thoughts and suggestions after we published the previous episode of this podcast, in which we discussed our plan at Lex Libertas. And so even though we have some podcast recordings lined up, we have decided that we'd like to use this episode, the one that follows on the episode in which we discuss or announce our plan, to talk about some of the feedback, some of the comments, some of the suggestions, to talk about where we are, how we are progressing in terms of this plan, to talk a little bit about our short-term goals, so what do we plan to do next, and then also to respond to some of the comments and also some of the criticisms. Now, at this point, I should perhaps apologize if my voice is a bit raspy. I am recovering from a flu and I had a little bit of a throat infection, but I'm through the worst of it and I'm sure I'll be back in action in a day or two. But I would still like to share with you some thoughts about our plan, where we stand, what we plan on doing next, and also, as I said, to respond to some of the comments and also some of the criticisms. Now, in this world in which we live, you cannot post something on social media that is vaguely political and not expect some criticisms. But I do think actually that some of the criticisms we've received over the last few days were very constructive, and I would like to elaborate on some of those points and respond to that as well. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about strategy, what we're doing, and where we're going. Now, before we start discussing today's video, I want to make a short announcement about this channel. You might have noticed that I've not been very keen to actively encourage people to subscribe to this channel. And I'm not always sure why. I just don't like asking people to subscribe. So the growth on this channel has been very organic, but it has been tremendous. We started this year with about 25,000 subscribers on this channel, and currently we are over 75,000. So since the beginning of this year, this channel that has been open for 8 years has grown threefold. And the reason why I want to ask you to subscribe is because we have set the goal for ourselves to reach 100,000 subscribers, not simply for the sake of having 100,000 subscribers, but because once we have reached that milestone, we intend on bringing some changes to this channel, which would include having a much more international focus. So on this podcast, and of course I'm particularly referring to the YouTube channel. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so forth as well. But on this podcast, we have had a focus on monologues or discussions such as this one, but also on interviews. And most of the interviews have been within South Africa, and we'll probably continue to do that. But there's so much that we can do to amplify our voice, to reach a more international audience when we start having more international guests and high-profile international guests on this channel. And so we intend on doing this once we reach 100,000 subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Now, I want to talk about Lex Libertas and where we stand. I'm not going to try to repeat or summarize the previous video. If you haven't watched it, the video is called Our Plan, the previous episode of the Pioneer Podcast. I would like to encourage you to go and watch it. But I want to talk about that a bit broader and in a bit more broad terms. And I want to start with the Hormosi equation, an equation developed by the business consultant Alex Hormosi, which of course was developed, I believe, primarily for the sake of business strategy with a focus on selling products and services. While we are not in that sphere, we are in the what you might call civil society sphere or the NGO sphere. We don't sell a product and we don't sell a service. We have a particular political objective in mind, political in the broad sense of the word. But it does seem to me that from this perspective, the Hormosi equation is just as valuable as it could be for private companies, if not more valuable. So yes, it's abstract, but it's a calculation, a proposed calculation by which you can determine the value of what you are doing, or if you are a company, what you are selling. Now, we're not selling something, we have a particular objective that we want to achieve. And I want to talk about our objective with reference to this equation. So the Hormosi equation, and this is my interpretation thereof, states that you can determine your value with reference to 4 variables, or a calculation of 4 variables. 2 of them are above the line. In other words, you want them to be as high as possible, and 2 of them are below the line. You want those to be as low as possible. And if you get that balance right, if the 2 above the line are as high as possible and the 2 below the line as low as possible, you're going to get maximum impact. And so I want to talk about these 4 with particular emphasis on 1 or 2. The 2 that are above the line are, firstly, how big is the dream that you are selling? And now in our case, we have a very clear vision statement, which is we want a viable political order for the peoples of South Africa. And it's a pretty big dream, or a pretty big vision. It's also an alternative vision, alternative to the visions that we hear about politics in South Africa. And so that has to be as high as possible, and I think it's pretty high on our side. Although I would say the room for improvement is to communicate this better so that it's more clear and people understand particularly or specifically what we mean when we talk about this. The second side of the line, or the second variable, is what is the perception among the public or among your market or your customers in terms of how realistic this vision is. And I believe, and we state this in our business plan, which we're going to publish soon, that this is one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge for Lex Libertas, is the perception on whether the goal is achievable. And I do think, and we at the team at Lex Libertas, we do believe that the goal or this vision of ours is achievable. But a lot of people seem to think that it's not achievable. And I would like to believe that with the publication of our plan in this video we published in the previous episode, with particular focus on the flywheel, the 5 aspects of what we intend to do, that if people understand that they would see that this goal is actually attainable. And so we need to keep talking about how we're going to achieve this in order to raise the perception on whether it's a realistic goal or not. Then below the line, the first point there is the expectation on the time frame involved. In other words, the quicker you can deliver, the higher the value. The longer it takes to deliver, the lower the value, or at least the more difficult it is to communicate your vision. And I do think that this is the second biggest challenge for Lex Libertas, is that we need people to understand, and we've been explaining this since the beginning, and we will continue to explain this, that we're not working with the type of objective that could be achieved overnight. As I mentioned in last week's episode, there's no button that we could push to change the political system in South Africa. If there was such a button, we would have pushed it already. But to get this type of macro political change, it's not simply a matter of making a decision or convincing some politician. It's about building a movement and momentum into a particular direction. And that, unfortunately, takes time. And so if your expectation is that you want to contribute to Lex Libertas, to see the change that we are talking about within a matter of months, I'm not sure how we can deliver that to you. But I'm pretty sure that we can achieve this change if we think of it as a long-term objective and something towards which we can increasingly build momentum as we have already started doing. I really think that this change is foreseeable, that it is realistic, that achieving this is realistic, but we have to be reasonable and realistic in terms of what it would take to get there. And then the fourth variable, or the second point under the line, is the type of sacrifice that it would take to achieve this goal. And now I have good news here, and we explained this a little bit in the video, and we explain it a bit more comprehensively in our plan that we're about to publish. And that is that for some people, for a very small group of people, we would need a significant sacrifice. And what I mean by that is a sacrifice in terms of doing this on a full-time basis, doing this as your job, you could say, or being involved full-time, perhaps as a consultant and so forth. And so for those people, including myself and the people who are already part of the team, they would, of course, need to be paid. They would need to have compensation because people can't work for free. But that is going to be a very small group, and we foresee that it will remain a small group because we would rather prefer to use our resources on big projects and initiatives as opposed to having a large bill in terms of salaries and so forth. But there will also be people who are involved as consultants who will make some form of a sacrifice in terms of having to spend much more time. But again, this would be a fairly small group. Then there would be a bigger group, and we've been flooded with people wanting to sign up on this. And I'm going to talk about our progress with the involvement of volunteers a bit later on in this video. But this second group is for people who have a full-time job, who are already committed to certain objectives and to certain things in their personal lives, but who do have some time available to contribute, to be more involved in terms of going out and doing things in their free time. And we're setting up what we call the Lex Libertas Club to empower people to do that. And I'll give some feedback on that later. And then the third part, which we hope to be a very big group, is the amount of people with regard to which we would need a very, very small sacrifice. And that would be people who are not actively involved because they prefer not to be, but who are willing to make a small sacrifice in the form of a small monthly contribution to what we are doing, because that would empower the rest of us to be much more actively involved. And so if we go back then to the Hormosi equation, effectively what we are saying is we need to keep communicating our vision, what that means, to make it as clear as we possibly can. We need to ensure that people understand that it is a realistic vision and that we have a plan for achieving this. But we also need people to understand that this is not the type of vision that we will achieve overnight, that it will take time. Obviously, the sooner the better, but we know that there are no quick fixes, and if there were, we would have done that already. And then the fourth is for people to know that it would take very little sacrifice. There are people who want to be actively involved on a full-time basis, and many have reached out to us, and we welcome that. If you would like to be involved on a full-time basis, send us your CV, send us an email, and we will look into that. If you would like to be involved on a part-time basis, to be part of this club that we are setting up, reach out to us. And if you're not prepared to do either of those, we hope that you would at least sign up as a contributor. Now, we have 10 strategic objectives at Lex Libertas, and I'm not going to discuss each of them now. That's not the point of this video. They are implied in the previous video that we discussed, even though we didn't list them. We will make a separate video later on in which we discuss each of the 10 strategic objectives, and they will be available on the website. But I want to talk about some of them, because since we started Lex Libertas, we have placed a particular emphasis on some of these, especially garnering international support, converting support into pressure on the South African government, and on organizational efficiency, which of course is an internal goal, to make sure that we have proper systems running and so forth. And we have spent a lot of time on that, and I believe the progress in terms of international garnering international support and converting international support into pressure is evident in South Africa. And of course, many other institutions are involved with that as well. But we have especially focused on this over the last few months at Lex Libertas. And I know for a fact that we have achieved many important outputs or outcomes as a result of our activities. And we are very grateful for the great work that other institutions are also doing in this regard. But we do need to have some form of a shift at the moment in terms of our goals, because we are a very new institution. We're just a few months old, and we cannot do everything at once. So thinking about the flywheel we discussed in last month or last week's video, we cannot yet do each of these 5 things at the same time. So we have to prioritize and then focus on them one at a time. And the same goes for our strategic objectives, which of course is connected or interconnected with the flywheel. So the focus would now shift to 2 goals in particular. We will still be involved with organizational efficiency and so forth, and to an extent with international support and so forth, but that would be secondary goals. The primary goals for now are, number 1, financial sustainability, and number 2, public participation. And when we say financial sustainability, we say that at Lex Libertas we are going to need at least 4,000 contributors, monthly contributors, which isn't a big number. It's actually a very small number. And of course, we would like to grow after that or beyond that. But for now, we believe, and according to our calculations and our plans and our budgets and so forth, that the quicker we can reach that point where we have at least 4,000 people saying, I'm going to make a small monthly contribution to the work that you're doing, the sooner we would be able to get this exponential growth. We would be able to get more people on board, to be able to focus on more than one thing at the same time, while still maintaining our core focus. So that is going to be a core focus, at least from now until the end of the year, and perhaps into the first months of the next year. And then public participation. So let's talk about the Lex Libertas Club. If I had my way, we would have launched the club already months ago. Unfortunately, it does take a bit longer than we anticipated, and that is because we want to make sure that we do it properly. Now, we have had some online meetings with our contributors. We have circulated a discussion paper on this, and we've gotten some feedback on that, and we've updated it. And where we are now is we have a small launch committee of young people who are very keen, very enthusiastic, about 5 people on that group, who have declared their willingness and availability to help us launch this club as a platform through which volunteers can become actively involved. Now, we could have launched it already, but what we are doing right now is case studies on different institutions across the globe that are doing something in some way similar to what we have in mind, to see how we can learn from them, what we can apply from that. From there, we will start publishing online content, and we are going to have an event in Pretoria to launch the Lex Libertas Club. I know there are many people, especially in Cape Town, but we have some interest in all the 9 provinces of South Africa and even some other countries as well. But especially from the Western Cape, we have a lot of people who would like us to come there and arrange some events, and we are very keen to do that. But where we are now, we are working with this launch committee that is preparing some drafts, some papers, some workshops and so forth. And then we're going to launch the first version thereof in Pretoria. We have already had, I don't know how many people. I think the first day we had 67 people sign up, saying who are already contributors, who have said that they want to be actively involved through this club as well. I'm not sure how many there are at the moment, but it must be more than 100 or hundreds of people. And so with these people, we will sort of start the first version of this club. And I'm very, very keen on getting this up and running and keeping you posted. But as I mentioned, we can only do one thing at a time. And we prefer to do one or at most two things at a time. But as we grow the institution, we will be able to do these things more efficiently. Now, let's talk about some of the comments that we have received. Now, let me start with just a comment on criticism itself. Almost all criticism is useful because you can learn something from criticism. And if a criticism does not contain an element of truth, then at least the element of truth is that is a particular perception. But when it comes to dealing with criticisms, of course, as I'm sure you know, you need to evaluate who the person is sharing the criticism, because you need to understand the motive behind that. And then you can consider how valid the criticism is. Because unfortunately, you will always find people who have malicious intentions, who just criticize for the sake of criticizing. We have had very, very little of that. And I'm actually surprised by just the extent to which we get positive feedback in terms of what we seek to achieve with Lex Libertas. Not just among one or two sections of society in South Africa, but from various communities. And we're going to talk more about that. There are some criticisms that I think are, or let me before I get to that. Now, in a certain sense, from a PR perspective, you don't want to talk about criticisms because you want to create the impression that you are above criticism. But I've never really understood that approach. I think it's much better just to talk openly about these things. And now, there are some criticisms that I think are not very valuable, that we don't really, that doesn't really concern us that much. And I'll give you three examples, or three in particular. One is that what is just the criticism that what you're trying to do will never work. Now, we get fairly little of that, but you do get that people saying that's just pie in the sky or whatever. And the reason why we're not too concerned about that is all the major political, and again, political in the broad sense of the word, political movements that have changed the course of history were continuously confronted with people saying that what they're trying to achieve is not going to work. The question is not so much what is the goal, well, that's an important part of the question, but equally important is, do you have a plan for attaining this goal, and then are you willing to execute that plan? We have a very clear goal, we have a very clear plan, and we are very committed to executing that plan. Another criticism is people saying, oh, this is just talk. We need to stop talking and start doing. I have spoken about this before. If you follow this podcast, our position is that we should never stop talking. And that's actually written into our vision statement, or our mission statement at least, that our mission statement is to achieve our vision for a viable political order by doing three things continuously, which is thinking, in other words, research, coming up with new creative solutions and so forth, using our brains, and then talking about this, converting our ideas into compelling arguments, raising awareness and so forth, and then thirdly, taking action based on this. So what people need to understand is it's not a choice between thinking, speaking, and doing, because you can do all three of these things at the same time. And a significant part of our doing would inevitably be speaking, raising awareness about what we seek to achieve, getting more people behind this goal, and then converting that, of course, into tangible action. And then a third criticism that doesn't concern us that much is one person in particular, actually, who keeps responding. I don't know who this person is, but who keeps responding to our posts by saying, oh, you guys just want money. And now, in a certain sense, the answer is yes, because we have a as Jim Collins would say, a big, hairy, audacious goal. We have a big objective. It's not the type of objective that you would achieve through the type of activities that doesn't cost money. We need to arrange big events. We need to have bigger podcasts. We need to do much better, much more comprehensive international outreach. We need to do each of those components of the flywheel that we have discussed in a big and a comprehensive way, which of course would imply spending money to do these things. So we're not too concerned about that. But there are some questions I want to get to, and we'll do a Q&A session, a more comprehensive, more detailed one later. But there are some bigger picture questions that we got in the last week that I think are very useful and worth discussing. And some of these questions are quite difficult, but I'm going to try them as succinctly as I can, because I think these questions are very important questions. The one question has to do with the political systems. So we get people asking, what exactly would a decentralized South Africa look like? And as I mentioned before, one part of the answer is that we know what it would look like, and another part is that we don't know. And what do I mean by that? We believe that the system needs to be decentralized, and we believe that there should be more autonomy. But we also know that that could take different forms, and I discussed some of those examples in the previous video. And when we publish our business plan, which is more a political plan than a business plan, you will see that there is an addendum to the plan in which we discuss more comprehensively some of the forms that we would be looking at. Federalism as an example, confederalism as an example, territorial autonomy, cultural autonomy, and so forth. So it could take different forms, and that's where the think tank part of Lex Libertas comes in, is we need to investigate these forms, and instead of just presenting one as the solution, go through a process with our contributors, with people who are willing to become involved, by discussing these different forms and reaching a conclusion. The second is, how would the transition work? Now, we get people saying, for example, I'm very excited about what you're doing and I want to become actively involved, but could you please explain to me exactly what the change would look like, how this would happen? And it's a very difficult question to answer, partly because we don't know, because it could happen in many different ways. And implied in that is also the question, how are we going to convince the South African government, or how are we going to convince the ANC or the ruling party? And part of the answer is we don't need to convince them, because all the significant political changes that I can think of, and perhaps you can give me some more examples, that happened over the last 100 years were, or you could even say few hundred years, several centuries, were cases in which people that would never have predicted or expected that those in power would agree to the change that eventually happened. The same thing happened in South Africa. Firstly, one would have never expected that the British Empire would have agreed to South Africa becoming a republic, but eventually they did, because the groundswell movement towards this change was so strong that they weren't able to ignore that. The same thing with the conversion from the white minority government or the apartheid system to the ANC takeover. One would have never expected that the National Party would have agreed. Eventually they didn't have much of a choice. But we can go to other examples. The breakup of the Soviet Union. One would have never expected that the Communist Party would have agreed to dissolving the Soviet Union, and so forth. We can mention many such examples. So the point is that significant political change doesn't need to happen, or doesn't need to be built on the notion that those who are currently in power would have to be convinced through rational arguments. Why? Because having a groundswell movement and building support, or as the ANC would say, influencing the balance of forces, is much more important. Now that could take different forms. And I think some people expect us to say something along the lines of that there would be a second CODESA movement, that there would be some big meeting where people would sit around a table and discuss it. And I'm sure there would be such meetings, but that's less important than the fact that we need to build tangible, measurable support, not just among Afrikaners of whom the majority are already convinced that this is necessary, but among the various nations and peoples living within South Africa. Another question we get that I think is a very good and a very important question is, who is us? So people listening to the podcast often hear me saying that we at Lex Libertas say this and we have discussed this. And then people would say, who is this we that you are talking about, because we only see you? And I'm very, very eager to change this. But once again, remember that it is a new institution. And so we are going to update our website very soon. And there are some important reasons why that information is not yet on the website. Partly because when we started Lex Libertas, we had a board of 3 people. And that board has now been expanded to 5 people. But we are currently going through the process of registering the updated version of the board. And so it would be premature to publish the names right now, but we are going to do that once we've gone through that legal process. But we have 5 people who are on the board, and the board, of course, is tasked to provide oversight to ensure that we act responsibly with our money, that we maintain our goal or our course towards achieving this goal, and so forth. As far as the staff component is concerned, we currently have 3 people, and we're going to put their names up on the website as well. But we have quite a few people who are involved almost on a full-time basis, some more than others, obviously, as consultants. In other words, people who we pay for particular services. And so if you include that, you could say that the team, excluding the board, is close to 10 people. And then, I don't want to say the most important part, but you could say the most important next part is, of course, this club, this committee of volunteers that we're setting up, and we're going to publish that soon. So if it was up to me, it would have been on the website already, but it would be premature to do so now because we're in the process of signing contracts, getting people on board, updating our documents with the government, where we need to ensure that everything is properly registered and so forth. And I'm pretty sure that within the next month or so, or at least by the beginning of next year, but it will be before then, you will be able to find all that information on the website, and we'll keep you updated on that. Then another question is, how are we going to get other groups to cooperate? In other words, what is implied in the question is, yes, Afrikaners agree, or white people in South Africa agree, or certain minorities agree, but how are you going to convince the majority? That's sort of the underlying question. And one part of the answer is that it's slightly misconstrued to simply think of South Africa as a minority and a majority. In a certain sense, South Africa is a country of minorities with a variety of different nations and peoples, none of which actually constitute a majority. But the underlying question, I think, still is valid, and it's an important point, and we need to talk about that. And I am not that pessimistic about this, because what I see and what we see, what we experience, not just by reading the news, but by speaking with people through the limited outreach we have done since we've started Lex Libertas just a few months ago, is that people from all walks of life in South Africa are utterly frustrated. But also that a lot of people don't yet see that the problem is deeper rooted than simply the ANC, or that the problem sprouts from a highly centralized political system that has become detached from realities on ground level. And so we think that from a recruitment perspective, and by recruitment I mean convincing more and more people to become involved and to buy into what we seek to achieve, we believe the low-hanging fruit are podcasters from various communities, of which we have contact with many who are very supportive already. So reaching out not just to podcasters, but people who are very influential among various communities, liaising with them, speaking with them, and so forth, speaking with them in a public way so that people can watch it and share it and watch it, of course, within the context of their communities. And another low-hanging fruit would be people who are leaders, not simply podcasters, but leaders within their various communities, especially traditional communities or cultural communities in South Africa. Once again, of which there are many who are frustrated with the fact that their culture is not respected by the South African government, that their traditional leaders, their royal families, or however they would describe their own structures, are not respected or recognized. And we believe, we are already speaking with some of these, but we believe that an easy and very important next step is to build these bridges. So I'm not that concerned about whether we're going to get more and more people on board. I think we know where to begin, and I'm sure that we will build this momentum. So there is a lot more that I want to discuss in this episode, but I don't want to make it too long. So for a future video or future episodes, I would like to get to the extent to which we are already making progress on those 5 aspects of the flywheel of Lex Libertas. I want to do a more interactive Q&A session, and I very much want to talk about the structure through which people can become more actively involved. But as we discussed in last week's episode, we have for now a primary internal goal and a primary external goal. Our most important internal goal right now is to get this movement or this institution growing up to at least 4,000 monthly contributors, because that would empower us to do a lot of these things. And our most important external goal is to get the idea that the system needs to be decentralized and that the peoples of South Africa should have more autonomy or more freedom within the context of their communities into the mainstream conversation. And we believe that this is a realistic goal. It is one that is measurable. We can track our progress towards this, and that is something that we are already working very hard on. If you have already signed up as a contributor, we are very grateful, and we look forward to working with you through the Lex Libertas Club. If you haven't signed up yet, please do so. We'll share the link in the description. And of course, as I mentioned, remember to subscribe to this channel, because we want to get this channel up to over 100,000 subscribers so that we can shift the focus to having a much more international conversation on this channel, dealing with the issues that we seek to achieve with Lex Libertas.